The basement light flickered once, then held steady, like it was deciding whether to be kind or not. Martha's hands shook around her phone while it buzzed against her palm, screen lighting up her face in that harsh blue. Call from Nate flashed again. She didn't answer. Not yet. A cold Starbucks cup sat on the top step like a forgotten prop from someone else's day, the plastic lid fogged from the damp air. She aimed her flashlight toward the far wall where the concrete looked different, darker in one rectangle, as if it had been patched and then regretted. The smell down here wasn't just mildew. There was something else. Old wood. Old paper. Something sealed up for a long time. Her slippers slid on the dusty floor, and she caught herself on the workbench. A tiny sound followed, not loud, just a thin little click, like a latch shifting. Martha froze. Her breath came short. She looked down. The concrete didn't crack. It didn't crumble. It was a wooden panel, hidden under a piece of old rubber matting, the kind Tom used under his tools. Her throat tightened as if her body knew the truth before her mind did. She lifted the edge of the mat with 2 fingers. A metal ring sat flush in the wood. A pull handle. A door. Upstairs, the house creaked the way it always did, the way it had since the kids were small. The sound used to mean life, late-night footsteps, a dishwasher humming, Tom clearing his throat in the hallway like he owned the air. Now it meant settling boards, empty rooms, and bills stacked on the kitchen counter that looked taller every week. Martha stared at the ring until her eyes watered. She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand and felt how thin her skin had become. She hadn't cried at the funeral. She'd cried later, alone, in the laundry room, pressing a towel to her mouth so no one would hear. "Tom," she whispered down into the basement like he might answer from behind the wall. "What is this?" It had been 8 months since he died, and the shock still came in waves. Some mornings she woke up and reached across the bed without thinking, her hand landing on cool sheets. Other days she remembered immediately, like someone had slapped a note onto her forehead. Widow. Alone. Figure it out. Martha lived in a small ranch house outside Columbus, Ohio, in a neighborhood full of modest lawns and older couples who waved like they were all still part of the same quiet agreement. The grocery store was 12 minutes away. The pharmacy knew her by name. Her mailbox was a steady stream of coupons, medical statements, and offers to refinance a house that was already paid off. At least that's what she thought. She told herself she was doing fine because she was still getting dressed every day, still making her coffee, still saying, "I'm okay," in the same tone people expected. But the truth was in the tiny decisions that wore her down. Heating or groceries. New tires or the dental cleaning she kept rescheduling. She had Social Security, a small pension from the school district where she worked as a secretary for 27 years, and a savings account that used to comfort her. Lately, that account looked like a shallow puddle. Tom had handled the money. Not in a controlling way, not the way people whisper about. It had just been their routine. He was the planner. Martha was the one who kept the house running, who knew which grandkid liked which cereal, who remembered birthdays and the neighbor's dog's name. Tom paid the bills, nodded at the bank statements, and said things like, "We're all right, Marth. Don't worry." She'd believed him because believing him was easier than asking for the whole truth. Their marriage had been steady, not perfect. They had their quiet arguments. They had the times when Martha felt unseen, like a lamp left on in a room nobody used. But Tom never raised his voice. He never disappeared for days. He came home every night, took off his boots, kissed her forehead, and asked what she wanted to watch. After he died, Nate and Alyssa came over with casseroles and worried faces and big promises. "We'll help you go through everything," Alyssa said, hugging Martha so tightly her ribs ached. "We'll make a plan." At first they did. They sorted clothes into donate piles and kept piles. They argued about who should take the old recliner. They found photos in drawers and laughed and cried in bursts that made Martha feel like a stranger in her own story. Then real life pulled them back. Nate had work travel. Alyssa had kids and schedules. Their calls became shorter. Their visits became, maybe next weekend. Martha didn't blame them. She just noticed. On a Tuesday morning in late November, the furnace made a coffee sound and quit. The house went quiet in that way that makes you feel like you're standing outside your own body. Martha wrapped herself in a cardigan and called the HVAC company. The young man who showed up smelled like clean detergent and peppermint gum. He was polite, cheerful, and quick to ask, "Where's the access panel?" "In the basement," Martha said, leading him down the steps carefully, one hand on the railing. Down there, the air was cold and wet. The basement had always been Tom's space. His workbench. His jars of screws. His stack of boards he kept, just in case. Martha rarely came down here unless she needed the holiday decorations or the extra paper towels. The tech crouched by the furnace, shining his light around. "Okay," he said. "Looks like your ignition's acting up. Might need a part." Martha swallowed. "How much?" He gave a number like he was reading the weather. Martha nodded like it was fine. Inside, she felt something brittle crack. She could afford it, but barely, and not if more things broke. And things always broke in old houses. While he worked, Martha stood near the stairs to keep out of his way. Her eyes drifted over the workbench, the pegboard, the shelf of labeled containers. That's when she saw it. A notebook, shoved behind a paint can, half hidden. It wasn't one of her recipe notebooks. It was thick, black, and dusty. Tom's handwriting was on the spine in block letters. House. Her heart gave a strange little kick. She didn't know why a notebook would scare her, but it did. She waited until the tech left, until his truck pulled away and the neighborhood quiet returned. Then she went back down with her phone flashlight on, like she was sneaking into someone else's basement. She pulled the notebook free. Inside were sketches, measurements, a simple layout of the house, notes in the margins that made no sense at first. Move box. Replace hinge. Seal edge. Her fingers traced a line drawn beneath the basement. A rectangle in a place that wasn't on any normal floor plan. Martha felt her mouth go dry. She looked up at the far wall, then back down at the page, then up again, as if her eyes could force the truth to become harmless. That was when she noticed the rubber mat. She hadn't remembered it being there, not like that. It was too neatly placed, too deliberate. The corner lifted slightly, like it wanted to be seen. Her phone buzzed again. Nate. Nate again. Probably checking on the furnace, probably being responsible in the way adult kids try to be when guilt pokes them. Martha didn't answer. She crouched, knees creaking, and slid her fingers under the mat. Dust stuck to her skin. The wood underneath looked older than the rest of the basement, worn but solid, like it had been used and then hidden. The metal ring was cold when she touched it. She wrapped her fingers around it anyway. Above her, the house made a soft settling sound, and for one sharp second Martha imagined Tom standing at the top of the stairs, watching her, not angry, just quiet. Like he was waiting to see if she'd finally stop trusting the easy version of things. Martha drew in a breath that felt too big for her chest. Then she pulled. The wooden door did not open all the way at first, and Martha had to push with her shoulder while holding the flashlight between her teeth, and the space beneath the house breathed out cold stale air that smelled like dust, cardboard, and time, and she felt a strange guilt, as if she were breaking a promise, even though no promise had ever been spoken. The hidden room was not large and not dramatic, and that somehow made it worse because it felt intentional and careful, and lived in by thought rather than impulse, and there were shelves along the walls holding old boxes neatly labeled in Tom's handwriting, and a small folding chair placed near the back wall like someone had once sat there just to think. Martha stood still, letting her eyes adjust, and her chest rise and fall, and she noticed how quiet it was in a way that felt heavier than silence upstairs because this was a quiet that had been chosen and protected. The first box she opened held folders wrapped with rubber bands, and inside were bank statements and loan papers and letters from institutions she recognized but had never interacted with directly, and her stomach tightened as she realized how much of her life had run parallel to his without ever touching. She did not feel angry right away, and that surprised her because anger would have been easier and cleaner, but instead she felt small and tired and deeply aware of her age and how much energy it took now just to understand one new thing. She sat on the folding chair and rested the folder on her lap, and the chair creaked under her weight, and for a moment she was afraid it might break and leave her stuck down here alone, and the thought made her laugh once quietly, which turned into a sigh. The papers told a story that was not dramatic but deeply human, and Tom had taken out small loans years ago when his hours were cut, and he had tried to cover gaps without worrying her, and he had moved money around and delayed telling her until telling her felt harder than hiding it. There were notes written in the margins, reminders to pay things off, and crossed out worries, and a few lines that read things will be better soon, and Martha felt a dull ache behind her eyes because she remembered those years and the tension in his shoulders and how she had assumed it was just age or work. She thought of the time she had asked if everything was okay and how he had smiled and said yes because he believed that was love, and she realized now that love had also kept him silent. Her phone buzzed again upstairs and she ignored it again because she needed this moment without outside voices, and she reached for another box and found something unexpected. Inside were cassette tapes labeled with dates and her name, and she stared at them confused because they had not owned a tape player in years, and she wondered why someone would record something meant to be kept hidden. She took one tape and turned it over in her hands and felt the weight of it and the care taken to store it, and she imagined Tom sitting down here alone pressing record and speaking into the quiet because he did not know how to speak to her directly. Martha closed her eyes and let the thought sit, and it did not crush her, but it did hurt, and it made her think of all the conversations they had postponed until later, and how later had quietly run out. She did not play the tape yet because she was not ready, and instead she climbed the stairs slowly carrying the notebook and one folder, and when she reached the kitchen she noticed how ordinary everything looked and how strange that felt now. The clock on the microwave blinked the wrong time, and the coffee cup was still cold, and everything seemed untouched by the discovery beneath the floor, and that made her feel lonely in a new way. That afternoon she went to the corner cafe near the pharmacy because it was a place Tom never went, and she ordered soup she barely tasted and sat near the window watching cars pass and people move through their lives without knowing anything about hers. An older woman sat at the next table and asked if Martha minded sharing the outlet, and Martha said no, and they exchanged small polite smiles, and the woman commented on the weather and the soup and then gently asked if Martha was waiting for someone. Martha surprised herself by saying no, and then by adding that she had lost her husband recently, and the woman nodded without rushing her, and said that losing someone rearranges your whole sense of space, and Martha felt seen in a way she had not expected. They did not talk long, but when the woman left she touched Martha's arm briefly, and said take your time, and Martha realized how rare it was to hear that without conditions. When she returned home she felt less afraid of the house and more curious, and she went back to the basement as the sun went down, and she sat on the chair again holding one of the tapes. She knew she could not undo what Tom had done or why he had done it, but she also knew that understanding was a kind of connection, and that maybe this room was not a betrayal but a sign of how much he had carried alone. She pressed the tape gently against her palm, and whispered his name once into the dark, not in anger, but in a question, and for the first time since he died she felt like she might be able to listen without falling apart. Martha carried the cassette upstairs and placed it on the kitchen table beside the notebook and the single folder, and she stood there for a long time with her hands resting on the chair back because sitting felt like giving in to something she was not ready to face. The house felt too quiet in the evening, and the usual sounds felt louder, like the refrigerator hum and the distant traffic and the ticking clock that still showed the wrong time, and she realized she had stopped correcting small things since Tom passed, as if accuracy no longer mattered. She searched through the hall closet and found the old tape player they once used in the car years ago, and it took effort to plug it in and figure out which button did what, and her fingers felt clumsy and slow, but she kept going because stopping would mean postponing, and postponing had already taken enough from her life. When she pressed play, the sound was rough at first, and then Tom's voice filled the room, and it startled her so deeply that she had to grip the table to steady herself, because hearing him without warning felt like opening a door she had believed was locked forever. His voice was softer than she remembered, and careful, like he was choosing each word while standing on uncertain ground, and he said her name once, and then paused as if listening for her response, even though he knew none would come. He talked about small things first, like the way she folded towels and how he liked watching her water the plants in the morning, and how he worried she did not rest enough, and Martha closed her eyes because these were details only someone close would notice, and it reminded her how love could exist quietly beside fear. Then his voice changed, not dramatically but in weight, and he spoke about money and worry, and the pressure of wanting to protect her from stress, and how each decision to hide something made the next decision easier until hiding became a habit. He said he was afraid of becoming a burden, and afraid of being seen as weak, and that he believed silence was strength, even though it slowly pushed him further from the person he trusted most. Martha felt heat behind her eyes, but she did not cry yet because the words were still settling, and she needed to hear them fully without interruption. Tom spoke about the room beneath the house and how he built it slowly and quietly because he needed a place where his worries could exist without spreading, and how he told himself it was temporary, and that one day he would clean it out and tell her everything when things felt stable again. He said stability kept moving, and that by the time he realized it had stopped he was already tired and ashamed and unsure how to begin. The tape ended with his voice saying he loved her and that he hoped she would forgive him, and the silence afterward felt heavier than the sound had been. Martha sat down slowly and stared at the wall across from her and noticed a faint stain she had meant to clean months ago, and she wondered how many things waited quietly for attention while life moved past them. She felt conflicted and tired and sad and understanding all at once, and she realized that forgiveness did not feel like relief but like work and patience and acceptance of imperfection. The next morning she called Nate and asked him to come over, and when he arrived she showed him the notebook and the folder and the tape player, and she watched his face change as he processed information he had never known, and she felt both protective and exposed. Nate reacted with frustration and concern and questions, and Martha listened calmly because she understood now that strong emotions came from love and fear, not judgment. She told him she needed time before making decisions and that she wanted to understand the whole picture before fixing anything, and he nodded even though it was clear he wanted to solve everything quickly. That afternoon Martha went back into the hidden room alone and sat with the boxes and the chair and the quiet, and she did not rush, and she did not open everything because she knew this space held years of emotion, not just paper. She thought about her marriage and how it had been built on routine and care and also avoidance, and how both people had chosen comfort over honesty at times. She realized the breaking point was not the discovery of the room but the understanding that love without openness could still leave people lonely. She allowed herself to feel grief for the version of their relationship that might have existed if they had spoken more honestly, and she accepted that regret could live alongside gratitude. As evening came she closed the hidden door gently and placed the mat back, not to hide the truth, but to protect it until she was ready to continue. For the first time she felt less afraid of what came next because she understood that facing the truth did not erase the past, but it could reshape how she carried it forward. Martha woke early the next morning and noticed how the light came through the kitchen window in a softer way than usual, and she stood there holding her mug with both hands and felt something settle inside her that was not happiness but steadiness. She did not rush downstairs and she did not avoid it either, and instead she made a short list in her head of small things she could do today, like calling the bank and sorting one box and taking a walk before dark. The house no longer felt like it was keeping secrets from her, and that shift mattered more than she expected because fear had always lived in the unknown, not in the facts themselves. Later that morning she sat at the table with her papers spread out and spoke on the phone with a patient woman from the credit union who explained options slowly and without judgment, and Martha realized how long she had assumed asking questions meant admitting failure. When the call ended she felt tired but not defeated, and she placed the papers back into a folder with care and labeled it clearly so she would not forget what it contained. In the afternoon she walked around the block and greeted neighbors she had avoided out of habit rather than intention, and one man asked how she was doing, and she answered honestly by saying she was managing, and the word felt real in her mouth. She thought about Tom while she walked, and not with anger or sadness but with clarity, and she saw him now as a full person who had been afraid and loving and imperfect just like she had been. Back at home she opened the hidden room again, and chose one box and brought it upstairs and worked through it, slowly stopping when she felt overwhelmed and continuing when she felt steady. She kept some papers and shredded others and made notes for later and allowed herself to pause without guilt because progress no longer felt like a race. That evening Nate returned and helped her move a small shelf upstairs, and they worked quietly together and shared stories about Tom that were not heavy, just human and sometimes even warm. Martha told Nate that she was not angry anymore, and that understanding had changed the shape of her grief, and he listened without interrupting, and hugged her in a way that felt mutual rather than protective. As days passed, the room beneath the house became less frightening, and more like a chapter that needed to be read carefully, and closed thoughtfully. Martha did not fix everything, and she did not need to, and instead she focused on what she could control, and let the rest take time. She began attending a weekly coffee group at the cafe, and found comfort in listening to others speak about loss and change and quiet victories. One morning she played another tape and listened without tears, and that felt like a sign of strength rather than distance. She learned that love could hold mistakes and still be real, and that forgiveness did not erase pain but softened its edges. The house remained old and imperfect, and the future uncertain, but Martha felt capable in a way she had not before. She had found the hidden room, but more importantly she had found her voice again, and the courage to face what came next. The secret had shocked everyone, but it had also taught her that truth, while heavy, could also be freeing. And as she turned off the basement light one evening, she understood that resilience was not about fixing the past, but about choosing how to carry it forward.